but they saw the card itself as a mechanism of independence and autonomy over their purchases. After one of the interviews, funnily enough, I'd stopped the recording and they joked and they were just like, one of the real reasons why I have a credit card is so I can hide purchases from my husband and then pay it back before I get in trouble. And I was like,
Secret Wise account are a real thing.
But they did mention having multiple credit cards and liking the freedom that it gave them.
Okay.
But that would have been an interesting direction to go down, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess now, like with the prominence of, you know, Apple Pay and using your phone to pay for everything, it's not even really going to matter anymore.
Totally.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Bianca. Like whether everyone thinks that that everyone paying for everything through Apple Pay is actually going to make the status cards redundant, because now it's just all going to be electronic anyway.
There's actually a quote that came out when I interviewed the younger cohort. They made a comment around, it was something along the lines of, I get the association between like platinum, bronze, gold membership, but I think they said that actually has no reference point for their life because they use like a single point of sale contact through their phone. And you can't see that, which is an interesting thing. Like what happens when you transfer the idea of status to your phone? Do people see phones as important? Does the older generation actually see the idea of status translate to a phone if they start using electronic methods? Or does it just become they never will?
Can I ask if you touched on rewards?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Bernie, so the colour is only one part of it. It does associate with limit, but the higher the limit or colour, then adds in the rewards, the earning capacity, the tickets to your lounges, your insurances. So your status is not necessarily just the color anymore, but you know what your limit or what your income then awards you as an incentive for using the card.
Yes.
Sorry, I meant their perceived status of what they gain using the card, not necessarily the status of the card itself.
Sorry. Yeah.
So like if you associate physical identity of independence through a physical card, what happens if you remove that card and say, here's an electronic card that happens through your phone? Do they lose that? Because you can't show the world your phone and say, I've got a credit card on my phone, but people can see you use your credit card and they can see the credit card. They see the color. They might be able to see like whether it says bronze or platinum or whatever, and they might know that association, but you don't have that on a phone.
Yeah.
So what becomes their identity?
Can I ask you about rewards? So, you know, because there was a couple of comments about that, and the idea behind rewards too is, well, you're going to spend the money anyway. You can afford to pay it back, which is what a couple of people have already said. So why don't I just get rewards for it? Why don't I actually benefit out of just a normal transaction? So one of the most popular ANZ cards was the ANZ Qantas card.
Flyer Black. Yeah. Qantas Frequent Flyer Black. Hugely
popular. And when that ceased, there was genuine uproar about it. So
what was the uproar? Can you give us some context? I'm not familiar with this card.
They changed the way it worked. You used to get status credits and lounge passes a little bit like Amex, and then when the Amex charger used to charge the merchant, and then it switched so that it would go back to the bank. So all the banks started to drop their Amex off, and then ANZ changed their Frequent Flyer Black offering. And yeah, I can imagine, because there was an uproar in all the banks. I wasn't with ANZ at that time, but the same thing happened at NAB.
Yep.
Yeah, right.
It was hugely popular. And it was Telstra too. There was, at one stage, there was the ANZ Telstra Qantas card.
Oh my God.
Sorry, Visa. Yeah.
Sounds like a football sponsorship jumper.
Yeah,
it probably was, yeah.
Qantas, ANZ, Telstra. That's the grand final.
It was significantly the most popular card that Visa
Telstra
had ever brought out.
Yeah, wow.
ANZ were a very big Visa handler, I think, and NAB were MasterCard, right?
Yeah, we switched though. Yeah, we dropped MasterCard in 2015, I think.
Yep.
I say we, I don't work there anymore. It was interesting. I wish I did.
But then one of the other big banks did the opposite, right? Didn't they jumped from Visa to MasterCard straight after that? I think it was St. George switched from
That's
Visa
not
to
a big bank. That's offensive, Adri. Come on.
Or was it Westpac? Maybe it was Westpac.
Yeah.
Where Westpac acquired St. George and then they transferred them to something like that. Anyway, Bridget, over to you.
Right. So you're ready to go on a journey, team.
Yeah, show us this mind map.
I just want to settle in. Hang on. Wait a minute. Switch down in my chair.
Okay. So interestingly enough, in finance, we had to study a balance sheet, and I chose Afterpay because I was like, well, I want to look at something I'm interested in. And I was reading a lot about how Australians are closing 1 million credit cards a year. So net, we're reducing the amount of cards we have, we're reducing the limit, and COVID has seen us reduce the debt. So I poked a little bit more around in that. And there's definitely less millennials taking up the cards. What I found in my interviews is a negative feeling towards credit cards. And not me asking, what do you think about credit cards? It was me asking, do you have a card? Have you had a card? And then proactively offering me the response of, just as a general rule, I don't like cards. And I found that really interesting. That was like a preface, almost like a disclaimer, which could have something to do with the participant bias. But generally what it tied down to is either experiencing credit card hardship themselves, knowing someone who struggled with cards, or just not having the financial literacy. In terms of the financial literacy, what surprised me the most was, because it sort of conflicts with my values around the fact that people choose to avoid them rather than learn, whereas that's just not how I have grown up or choose to operate, and not just with cards, but with anything. So the fact that it's like, I don't understand them and therefore I will not use them. So to me, that speaks to, risk versus benefit, or risk versus reward. Not understanding also has a little bit of shame behind it, I think, a little bit of embarrassment. So that's just up here. And that makes them worry more about their financial future. Like, I'm 29. I learned simple and compound interest in school, but no one taught me how to apply for a loan, that sort of thing. So it links into that worry for financial future. And again, with that shame factor. The other part I found really interesting is 2 of my candidates do feel very comfortable with credit cards and how they work. One of them doesn't have one anymore, but they feel this sense of responsibility to educate their friends. It's like a protective primal urge to say, this is bad. They're activists against having credit cards. And neither of them had been in hardship. It was someone they knew. And when it comes down to it, again, with that financial literacy, they get to the bottom, the terms and conditions at the end, and they're like, I'm just too far through this now. Like, I'm really happy with what I'm doing. Yeah. Click accept. In that application period, I've become excited about what I could spend this money on. And by the time it gets to the end, click accept. Even when I was setting up the Zoom today, click accept. Like, I don't read any of that. No one does. Which again ties into banks not being approachable. So millennials don't want to call up and ask for help. They don't want to go into a branch and ask for help. It needs to be digital, and it needs to be fast and easy. And the terms and conditions are not user-friendly. So by banks choosing not to make their information education friendly to the biggest, most powerful demographic in our time, it's offensive to millennials, who are also the most offended demographic of time. It's rejecting their way of learning, and potentially could be why they are rejecting the status of the credit card. The no proactive help came up quite a bit, and not being aware of the assistance. So 2 had actually had credit cards. One of them had spent the limit within 2 months, and then it took 2.5 years for her to pay it back. And the bank's calling her and saying, like, you got to pay this back, and sending letters and all that sort of stuff, but it wasn't proactive, and she didn't know she could ask for help, so she just didn't. The help is definitely there. Like, the time frame that she was experiencing that, she just didn't ask the question. So why is it up to the consumer to ask the question? Like, the banks know the algorithms. We know what the signs of trouble are. And again, it just triggers this defense insecurity. When you start talking about things that are close to home for people, they get defensive again. That disclaimer, that just so you know, I think credit cards are bad, kept popping up. What I listed in my assignment in terms of what I think I would actually do differently is somehow test the financial literacy against these responses, because even though 2 of these women are master's level educated, it doesn't mean they understand cards and interests and those sort of things. Interesting point that came up around the instant gratification that it offers, which is linked to gambling addiction quite closely, around I can do it now, I can pay it back later. Again, with that sort of sports bet on the punt, whatever, quite an interesting link there. And then, of course, watching someone going through credit card struggles. So we had a brother, a sister, an uncle, and a mum. So these aren't just someone you've heard of or someone you've known. They shared really personal insights about what happened to that family member, the sacrifices they made, or the help they had to get. And it comes back to that protective, you know, I want to protect people from going through that, or I don't want to go through that myself. And there's a sense of achievement for not having a card. Like, I don't have to have a card to do what I want to do. But on the flip side, there's that status of, you know, if you can manage a credit card well, you're obviously a genius. Like, you're obviously beyond this world, not within the bell curve, which was a really interesting thought process to go through as well. But anyway, I think I've talked through most of the board now. I had a lot of themes I could have put on here. It was really hard not to put them all on, but they felt.
Who's going to ask?
Well, I mean, I'm going to go for it. So, what was the most surprising insight Bridget that you came across?
Oh wow, what do you know? Definitely the active choice to say, I'm just not going to learn about this. We live in a digital age where there is message saturation. There are whole podcast groups of finance. Like, there's so much information out there about how to use a credit card that you don't have to sign up and pay for. So just the active choice to say, I'm happy being ignorant and not using that credit card was the biggest surprise for me.
It's interesting. Like, there's a lot to unpack here. So, like, the first thing that, like, there is a lot to unpack here. I feel sorry for this recording size. Did your cohort speak to actually being offended by the use of language used by the banks to make it unattainable or hard to understand?
No, they didn't. And there's still a question when we talk about whose responsibility is it, because someone said the government, someone said our parents, ourselves, the schools. Quite a few people did settle on the responsibility of the bank in an individual circumstance to say, if I'm giving you this credit, then we both need to know that you can manage it successfully, you know, setting people up for that success. But general financial literacy, no. And then there seemed to be a sense of, I really should have been the one to do that. I'm a big girl. I'm old enough to sign and read. I know I didn't click. There was a lot of accountability there. The bank hate was more, I don't trust them to teach me, because don't they just want me to use their credit card?
What's the incentive for the bank to teach you how to use a credit card properly? Which is like it's a fair point. Like, what is their incentive?
Well, heaps. If you have a great credit report and great credit history and you're comfortable with debt, you'll get the money, the loans that make the bank money. If you can't manage a credit card and we send you on a journey of poor financial management, you may never actually become profitable to the bank.
I think that's interesting.
A profit maker.
That's an interesting point, though, because when you look at because you come from like such a vast knowledge of what credit cards are, but if you asked a normal user, I think their perception is going to be that the banks want me to spend money so that I create, you know, debt and I have to pay them back interest, which, to your point, is actually a liability for the bank because it takes longer for them to pay back money, right? But I feel like
secured. We've got no recourse. After statute of limitations, you walk away. 3 years later, it's written off. I just wrote off a $37,000 credit card today.
There you go. See you later. But the banks don't share those stories, which is why I think it's interesting. The second thing I was going to point out was you mentioned having 2 of your individuals being master's level qualification, which means they're not afraid to learn, which means that like there's demonstrated capability that they can learn, which then speaks to what's the psychologically, like the perceived mechanism that they have or learned association they have with the banks to be
exactly
like it's almost like untouchable. They're untouchable. They're not going to, it's very interesting, like the lack of trust that's there.
Well, my population has older parents, which I noticed afterwards, just knowing them in social circles. And a lot of them were saying, go and get a credit card so the banks know you can spend money. It was that whole, you need to prove that you're good, which is just fictional, like we've spoken about. And the way that, you've got to behave for the bank is where the parents come from. And that sense of rebellion, then for these millennials from their Gen X parents, I suppose, and the fact that, well, I don't want to obey the banks. I don't want to say, yes, I'll be good for you. I don't think it comes from the parents directly. I think it's a result of the parents' conversation.
It's very interesting because there's a lot of education or learned associations that happen young and persist quite significantly into later life.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that wraps up our themes.
Shall I stop the recording
pause?
for a minute? Yep.